is that Kansas is at an early crossroads. Now, on Saturday, after Kansas beat Princeton, Bill Self, postgame, said that Darryn Peterson is likely out for the immediate future with a nagging hamstring injury. This could not be coming at a worse time for the Jayhawks. Now, if you've heard me, I have questioned throughout the summer, throughout the preseason, and throughout the first couple of games for Kansas, if the supporting cast for the Jayhawks was good enough to give Darryn Peterson the type of support that he needed for Kansas to once again be one of the best teams in college basketball and play its way to be a top 16 protected seed on Selection Sunday. And if you take Darryn Peterson away from that, you are going to have a lot of early season struggles coming up if you're the Kansas Jayhawks. Because even with Darryn Peterson, I still question the supporting cast for Kansas. And without him, Kansas was in a possession game in the second half with a Princeton team that lost Xavion Lee as a transfer to Florida and lost Caden Pierce, who was one of their best players, to the transfer portal. This is not vintage Princeton. This is not the Tosan Awoa Princeton that we remember from 2023 that was a part of the Princeton team that went to the Sweet 16 under Mitch Henderson. So we'll see just how long Darryn Peterson is out. It's a major disservice to college basketball, and it's an unfortunate circumstance for college basketball if he does miss an extended period of time. But hamstrings are things that can nag for a really, really long time unless they're taken care of. But early on in the season, if Kansas and this rendition of Kansas does not have Darryn Peterson, they could be in for an incredibly, incredibly difficult stretch. Tuesday night at Madison Square Garden, Kansas is going to get Duke in the Champions Classic at the Mecca. Without Darryn Peterson, that, in my opinion, will be at least a 15-point win for the Blue Devils. But beyond that, this is what's staring Kansas down right now coming up. Next week in the Players Era Festival, Notre Dame and Syracuse are guaranteed opponents. The third game is TBD. They need Darryn Peterson to beat Notre Dame and Syracuse on a neutral court. Notre Dame and Syracuse are both improved from last season. Then after Vegas, you got Dan Hurley and UConn coming to Fog Allen Fieldhouse in early December. And then there's a neutral site game, pseudo, in Kansas City against Missouri. Pseudo-neutral site game. It'll be pro-Kansas, but that's still a hard opponent. It's not of Darryn Peterson. Hopefully he's back. And then you have at NC State. Even with those players, that is a murderer's row type of slate for Bill Self in Kansas. And I'll say this. Just when you think about the totality of Kansas's remaining schedule, Kansas has 27 regular season games remaining before the Big 12 tournament. 25 of those games are against power conference opponents. So even if you had Darryn Peterson, how many of those 25 games are the Jayhawks going to win? Can they go 18-7? Can they go 17-8? Don't be surprised if Kansas is once again a double-digit loss team. And the next time we see the Jayhawks, it will be Tuesday night at Madison Square Garden against a Duke team that, in my opinion, is, I don't want to say off the radar, but I think the long-term defensive potential of Duke is the long-term defensive potential of a team that can get back to the Final Four. And I'm watching very closely at my guy Dame Sarr on the wing, who I love, and I've loved since I saw him in practice, and what happens at point guard with Caleb Foster and Cam Boozer. Now, unless Darryn Peterson goes into the phone booth and becomes, Superman and plays, this takes a little bit of air out of the Champions Classic because we could have a blowout in one of the games. That makes the game between Kentucky and Michigan State the showcase game in the Champions Classic on Tuesday night at Madison Square Garden. Michigan State has the signature win over Arkansas, but Michigan State still feels like a team that could be standing on the tip of Montauk with a handful of pebbles and not get anything in the ocean. Spartans right now as a team are 13 of 60 from three. They were 1 of 14 from three against Arkansas. Still won the game. Jackson Kohler, as I talked about a lot in the preseason, has emerged as the go-to guy for this team. He's averaging a double-double, 14-13. Remember, he was Michigan State's best player against Auburn last March in the NCAA tournament in the Elite Eight loss. But Michigan State needs more offense. Again, we got 4 guys cemented for the Spartans. Fears, Konkar, Cooper, Jackson Kohler, and then we're kind of rotating guys at the 5th spot. And this is not the last time that Tom Izzo is going to play a blue blood before the Big Ten starts. Michigan State has got North Carolina coming up on Thanksgiving Day in Florida, and Michigan State will also host Duke in East Lansing on December 6th. So the Spartans are coming up on a stretch where in about 2.5 weeks, they're going to play 3 of the sport's premier blue bloods. And I don't think Michigan State is going to be able to be legitimately viewed as a team that can get to a Final Four until it finds some sort of perimeter offense, somebody who can take the ball and go get a bucket. And what about Kentucky? What about the Wildcats? Well, Mark Pope, after the win on Friday night, by-game win, went to the press conference and gave a quote that he thought and wished that this group would be further along. Well, I don't want to say it's Murphy's Law, but Kentucky has had unfortunate circumstances at 2 incredibly key spots. Jalen Lowe, the transfer from Pitt, has had multiple issues with his shoulder in the last month. Jalen Lowe was brought to Rupp Arena to spray the ball around and be in a situation where he could get people buckets. He has not been near 100%. I text messaged and texted with his father, Marlon Lowe, last night and asked if there were any updates. He said Jalen is still rehabbing. There's no timetable for a return. So you take away the player you brought in to magnify and amplify all this great depth you have. Now, with him out of the lineup, it looks like the 5 that Mark Pope will turn to: Denzel Aberdeen, Colin Chandler, Otega Owe, Mohamed Diabate, and Brandon Garrison. And again, I'm not so sure that Brandon Garrison would be the starting center if Jaden Quaintance was healthy, the transfer from Arizona State, who's coming off an ACL injury. Jaden Quaintance, if he's healthy, is a National Defensive Player of the Year candidate. But right now, Kentucky is not as far along as Mark Pope hoped because you have issues health-wise protecting the rim at the 5 spot with Jaden Quaintance, who I think is a National Defensive Player of the Year candidate, and you have issues at point guard. Those are things that cannot be understated. But now, with the situation with Darryn Peterson, unless he can miraculously play on Tuesday night at the Garden, Kentucky-Michigan State becomes the game that is the showcase game in this event. And it's a big-time spot for Kentucky at the Garden. Regardless of whether or not Kentucky is healthy, with the money that was reportedly spent on this roster, you have to perform like you're one of the best teams in the country. And I was always taking a little bit of a pause on the Wildcats. And I'm always taking a little bit of a pause on a team that surrenders the amount of points that Kentucky did last week against Louisville, giving up 96. It's going to be real interesting to see how they perform against Michigan State coming up Tuesday night at the Garden. Now, the third big thing